Part 1. The Gathering Shadows. The night was thick with fog, each step muffled by damp earth. It was the kind of night that seemed to absorb sound, making even the faintest whisper feel like a shout. Rachel had felt the pull to return to her hometown after years of silence, an urge she couldn't explain, but it was relentless. Even though the memories of her childhood here were hazy, there was one thing she remembered clearly: the old, abandoned mansion on the edge of the forest. Everyone called it Blackwood Manor. It loomed on the outskirts of town, wrapped in layers of ivy and mystery. Growing up, she and her friends had dared each other to peek through its broken windows or stand in the shadow of its wrought iron gates, but none of them ever crossed the threshold. They all knew the tales, how people who entered sometimes didn't come out. Tonight, standing before the manor's gates, Rachel felt that old sense of dread tighten in her chest. It was irrational. She was an adult now, no longer bound by childish fears. Yet, as she reached out to push open the gate, a chill ran down her spine, sharp and cold, as though unseen eyes were watching her, drawing her forward. The gate creaked open, a long, groaning sound that echoed through the empty grounds. She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder. The town's lights were barely visible through the thick trees, casting faint glows on the dense fog that clung to the ground like an unnatural mist. Taking a deep breath, Rachel took a step forward, her boots crunching over the leaves that littered the path to the front door. "Rachel!" A voice hissed from behind her, startling her so much she nearly stumbled. It was Ethan, her childhood friend, who'd always been the more daring of the two. He had a flashlight in hand, his expression half hidden in the shadow, but his eyes shone with a peculiar excitement that sent a fresh wave of unease through her. "Are you actually going in?" he asked, his voice tinged with that same thrill he'd always had when they were kids. Rachel laughed nervously. I don't know, but it feels like I should. Like something is waiting for me." Her voice dropped to a whisper as her gaze shifted to the dark windows. Part 2. The Unearthly Silence. As they stepped inside the manor, a silence fell over them, heavy and unnatural, like a thick veil that dulled all sound. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating peeling wallpaper and cobwebs that glistened like strands of silver in the dim light. They walked slowly, each step measured and cautious. The air was stale and suffocating, carrying the faintest scent of decay. Rachel shuddered, clutching her arms as they moved deeper into the house. She could feel it, that intangible sense of something watching, lurking in the shadows. "You remember the stories, don't you?" Ethan whispered, barely loud enough for her to hear. "About the family who lived here, and how they just disappeared?" She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She remembered the stories all too well. The family had been reclusive, rarely seen in town, and rumors had swirled for years about strange sounds and shadows flickering in the manor's windows long after they were gone. Some said they'd performed rituals, that they'd been involved in the occult, and that their spirits still haunted the halls. As they continued exploring, the temperature seemed to drop with every step. Rachel could see her breath misting in the flashlight's beam. They turned a corner into a large sitting room, filled with antique furniture draped in dust-covered sheets. The silence grew heavier, pressing down on her chest like a weight. She wanted to leave, to run back to the safety of the town, but something kept her there. An inexplicable pull she couldn't resist. And then, they heard it. A soft, rhythmic creak from somewhere above them, like footsteps crossing the floor above. Ethan shot her a nervous glance, and Rachel's heart pounded. She opened her mouth to say something, but no sound came out. The creaking grew louder, more insistent, as though whatever was moving had become aware of their presence. Let's go back," Ethan whispered, but his voice was filled with doubt. Just then, there was a sharp, shattering sound from upstairs. A mirror, perhaps, or a window. The noise echoed through the silence, piercing and unnatural, making them both jump. Before they could react, something cold and unseen brushed past Rachel, chilling her to the bone. She gasped, clutching her arms as her skin prickled. "Did you feel that?" she whispered, barely able to speak. Ethan nodded, his face pale in the dim light. He looked up at the dark staircase that led to the upper floor, his flashlight casting strange shadows that seemed to shift and writhe. Part 3. The Voices in the Walls. Ethan's flashlight flickered as they approached the staircase, and the pale beam cast fleeting shadows across the peeling wallpaper. Rachel noticed intricate designs along the walls, symbols half hidden beneath layers of grime and dust, shapes that seemed to twist and shift if she stared too long. "Did you see these before?" she asked, trailing her fingers over a faint swirl of what looked like overlapping circles and lines, carved into the wall just above the baseboard. The wood felt strangely warm under her touch, almost as if something pulsed behind it. Ethan shook his head, swallowing hard. "No, this place is giving me the creeps. It's like it's alive." A soft murmur seemed to echo from the walls as he spoke, barely perceptible, like the sound of someone whispering just out of reach. Rachel froze, straining to listen, but the voice dissolved into silence. She glanced at Ethan, who looked back with wide, fearful eyes. "You heard that too?" she whispered. He nodded, his face pale. "Yeah, let's see what's upstairs, and then get out of here." They climbed the staircase slowly, each step creaking beneath their weight. The banister felt smooth but unnaturally cold, as if it had been untouched for centuries. Rachel felt as though they were intruding on something ancient and malignant, something that lay dormant but was beginning to stir. The upper floor was dim, the air thick with dust and an odd, sickly sweetness that made Rachel's stomach turn. A long hallway stretched before them, lined with closed doors. She felt a strange sensation, a subtle pressure urging her forward, drawing her toward the last door at the end of the hall. "Do you feel that?" she asked Ethan, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the door. "It's calling us, isn't it?" They walked slowly, the silence broken only by their cautious footsteps. As they neared the door, Rachel felt a tingling sensation at the back of her neck, as though she were being watched from behind. She turned, but the hallway was empty. The shadows, however, seemed to ripple, darkening as if they were converging on them. When they reached the door, Ethan hesitated. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice shaky. Rachel took a deep breath. "No, but I have to know." She reached for the doorknob, her fingers brushing against something sticky and cold. She jerked her hand back, wiping it on her jacket. The door creaked open, revealing a small room bathed in an eerie, pale glow from a dusty window. The walls were covered in strange markings, symbols and words in a language she couldn't understand. But in the center of the room was what drew her attention most. It was a mirror, tall and ornate, framed with twisting metal vines that seemed to glisten, almost as if they were wet. The glass was covered in a thin layer of dust, but Rachel could see her reflection staring back at her, hollow-eyed and pale. She took a step closer, her hand trembling as she reached out to wipe the dust from the glass. As her fingers brushed against the mirror, she felt a jolt, as though a surge of electricity had shot through her. She gasped, stumbling back as a chill washed over her. And then, in the reflection, she saw it. A shadow standing just behind her, its eyes hollow and dark, watching her with an intensity that felt almost familiar. "Rachel." Ethan's voice cut through the silence, snapping her back to reality. She spun around, but there was no one there. Only the empty room, silent and still. "Did you see it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan looked at her, his face pale. "See what?" "The shadow," she stammered. "It was right behind me, in the mirror." He shook his head slowly, but his gaze drifted toward the mirror, his face tightening as though he, too, could sense something lurking within it. Part 4. Secrets Unearthed. They backed out of the room, closing the door behind them, but the unsettling feeling remained. Rachel could still feel the presence, the weight of unseen eyes watching her, filling her with an inescapable dread. As they turned to leave, a low, rumbling sound filled the hallway. It was faint at first, barely noticeable, but it grew louder, swelling into a deep, menacing growl that seemed to reverberate through the walls. Ethan grabbed her arm. "Run!" They sprinted down the hall, their footsteps echoing through the manor. But as they reached the stairs, they found the way blocked by shadows, thick and dark, swirling like smoke. Rachel skidded to a halt, her breath coming in short gasps. What is that?" she choked out. Ethan shook his head, backing away from the swirling darkness. "I don't know, but we're not alone here." The shadows writhed, coalescing into a figure that seemed to flicker in and out of existence, its form shifting between human and something far less natural. It stood at the top of the stairs, blocking their escape, its eyes burning with a malevolent gleam. Rachel clutched Ethan's arm, her heart pounding as the figure took a step forward. She could feel its gaze piercing through her, as though it could see every secret she'd ever hidden, every fear she'd ever felt. "What do you want?" she whispered, her voice barely a breath. The figure didn't answer, but a low, guttural sound escaped its lips, a sound that resonated with an ancient, unspeakable horror. It raised a hand, and Rachel felt an invisible force pulling at her, drawing her toward it. "No!" Ethan shouted, grabbing her hand and pulling her back. "We have to go now." They stumbled backward, moving down the hallway as the figure advanced, its movements slow but relentless. The walls seemed to close in around them, the shadows growing thicker and darker, pressing in from all sides. Finally, they reached the staircase on the opposite side of the manor, half hidden behind a broken door. They raced down the steps, not daring to look back. The sound of the figure's footsteps echoed behind them, growing louder, closer with each passing second. They burst through the front door, gasping for breath, and stumbled into the open air. The fog had thickened, wrapping around the manor like a shroud, and the night was silent once more. But Rachel could still feel the darkness clinging to her, the weight of unseen eyes watching from the shadows. Ethan glanced back at the manor, his face pale. "We can't go back there ever." Rachel nodded, but something inside her knew it wasn't over. The manor had left its mark on her, and as she stared into the darkness, she knew the shadows would follow her, lurking at the edge of her vision, waiting for the moment she was alone. Part 5. The Forbidden History. Rachel couldn't sleep for days after the night at Blackwood Manor. The shadows haunted her dreams, whispering secrets she couldn't understand, tugging her back toward the manor's dark allure. She spent hours poring over old records, newspapers, anything that could shed light on what had happened there. But the deeper she dug, the more disturbing the pieces became. Finally, she uncovered something chilling. Joseph Blackwood, the last known owner of the manor, had once been a respected member of the community, a doctor with an uncanny knowledge of herbal medicine, rumored to have dabbled in alchemy. But as the years passed, strange stories began to circulate. Neighbors whispered that they'd seen figures lurking around the manor at odd hours, shadowy gatherings that stretched late into the night. One article mentioned Sarah Blackwood, his wife, who had vanished without a trace. It was said that Joseph had taken her to a better place, though no one could confirm what he meant. Shortly after, the household staff quit, each reporting strange sights and sounds. But all were too terrified to speak about what they'd seen. It seemed Joseph had been left entirely alone in that grand, crumbling mansion until he, too, disappeared. The final entry was cryptic, a note scrawled in his hand, found nailed to the door by a passing traveler. "What was bound in darkness will walk in shadow again." Rachel's heart raced as she read the words over and over. Something twisted inside her, a dark thrill mingled with dread. She felt as though Joseph Blackwood's eyes were watching her from beyond the grave, drawing her back to the manor. She needed answers, but fear kept her from going back alone. Ethan, against his better judgment, agreed to accompany her. His reluctance was clear, but he couldn't deny the strange fascination that drew them both to Blackwood Manor. They met at dusk, the last traces of sunlight casting eerie shadows over the house. The fog had returned, thick and impenetrable, clinging to the ground like a silent warning. "Are you sure about this?" Ethan asked, gripping a flashlight with a white-knuckled hand. Rachel nodded. "We have to know, Ethan. There's something here, something waiting for us." As they stepped inside, a faint, echoing laughter seemed to drift through the hall, almost like a child's, playful but chilling. Rachel froze, her heart thudding painfully in her chest. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, barely daring to breathe. Ethan's face paled, but he nodded. Let's keep going. Maybe it's just an echo. But they both knew it was more than that. Part 6. The Shadow's Embrace. They walked deeper into the manor, guided by Rachel's growing sense of unease. The air grew colder, carrying a scent like dried herbs and something sharp, metallic. Rachel shivered, remembering the rumors of Joseph's experiments. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that unseen eyes were following their every move. As they turned a corner, Rachel noticed a door she hadn't seen before, half hidden behind a thick curtain of ivy that had broken through a shattered window. She approached it slowly, her fingers trembling as she reached for the handle. The metal was icy cold, sending a jolt up her arm. The room beyond was unlike any other in the manor. Strange symbols lined the walls, drawn in a thick, dark substance that looked almost like dried blood. In the center of the room was a circle etched into the floor, surrounded by candles that had long since burned out, leaving behind streaks of melted wax. The air was heavy with an unnatural silence, as though the room itself were holding its breath. Rachel's gaze fell on a book lying open on a table at the far end of the room. The pages were filled with strange, looping symbols, along with English phrases scrawled in an uneven hand. Life from death, shadow from light. Ethan picked up the book, his face twisting in confusion as he flipped through the pages. This looks like some kind of ritual, but I don't understand. What was he trying to do? A soft, rasping voice echoed through the room, low and sinister. He was trying to come back. They both whipped around, but the room was empty. The voice, however, continued, drifting from all directions at once. Joseph Blackwood never left. He's been here, waiting. Rachel's blood ran cold. The voice sounded familiar, as if it were a part of the house itself, woven into the walls, into the very air they breathed. She took a step back, clutching Ethan's arm, but he was frozen, his eyes wide with terror. Slowly, the shadows in the corner of the room began to coalesce, forming a figure cloaked in darkness. It was tall and thin, its face hidden in shadow, but Rachel could feel its gaze locked on her, piercing through her skin, reaching into her mind. She tried to look away, but it was as though her body refused to obey. The figure took a step forward, and Rachel felt a wave of dread wash over her, so intense it was almost suffocating. It extended a hand, and she could see the faint outline of fingers, long and bony, reaching out toward her. "No," she whispered, backing away. This can't be real." The figure paused, its head tilting as if it were studying her. Then, in a voice barely louder than a breath, it spoke again. "You came back, just as he knew you would. The bloodline must continue." Rachel felt a sickening chill as she realized what it meant. She was connected to this place, to the darkness that had claimed Joseph Blackwood, and now it wanted her. Ethan snapped out of his trance, grabbing her arm and pulling her back toward the door. They stumbled out of the room, slamming the door behind them, but the whispers continued, seeping through the walls, following them down the hallway. They ran, their footsteps echoing through the empty halls, but no matter how fast they moved, the shadows seemed to close in around them. The house was alive, shifting and twisting, leading them deeper into its clutches. Finally, they reached the front door and burst out into the night, gasping for breath. The fog had thickened, pressing in from all sides, and the air was filled with the faint sound of laughter, mocking and relentless. Rachel looked back at the manor, her heart pounding. She knew that this wasn't over. The darkness had marked her, and no matter how far she ran, it would follow her, waiting for the moment she was alone. As she and Ethan stumbled away, she heard the voice one last time, drifting through the night like a sinister promise. Blood calls to blood, and the shadows never forget. Part 7. The Final Descent. Weeks passed, but Rachel could find no escape from the shadows. Every night, she was haunted by dreams of Blackwood Manor. Its empty halls, the flickering shadows, the echo of whispers that seemed to call her name. The darkness felt alive, as though it had latched onto her very soul, refusing to release its grip. She saw shadows lurking in every corner, felt invisible eyes watching her even in broad daylight. Her mind was unsteady, slipping further from reality with each passing day. Ethan, too, had been affected. He'd grown distant, his eyes hollow and dark, and he barely spoke anymore. They both knew the truth. The manor had marked them, and there was only one way to end it. One cold, moonless night, Rachel made her decision. She called Ethan and told him that she was going back to Blackwood Manor, alone. There was no sense in dragging him into this nightmare any further. He tried to argue, but she could hear the relief in his voice when she insisted he stay behind. As she approached the manor, the fog hung thick over the ground, curling around her feet like ghostly tendrils, welcoming her back. The door creaked open as she stepped inside, and a suffocating stillness settled over her, pressing against her skin. She could feel the house watching her, waiting for her to take that final step deeper into its clutches. The voice was there, waiting for her in the silence, whispering in tones so low they seemed to come from inside her own mind. "You came back, Rachel, just as you were meant to. Blood calls to blood." She followed the voice up the grand staircase, her steps slow and unsteady, as though the house itself were guiding her. The walls pulsed with a faint glow, illuminating symbols she hadn't noticed before. Swirling patterns that seemed to reach out to her, to beckon her deeper. The voice grew louder, more insistent, and she knew exactly where it was leading her. Back to the hidden room, the place where she had first seen the shadow, where she'd felt Joseph Blackwood's presence calling to her. The door opened on its own, revealing the room just as she'd left it. The strange symbols still lined the walls, and the mirror in the center of the room glistened, untouched by time. She took a step closer, her reflection staring back at her, hollow-eyed and weary. "Joseph," she whispered, barely able to breathe. "What do you want from me?" The shadows in the room began to twist, gathering together until they formed a figure that stood just behind her in the reflection. A tall, dark silhouette with hollow eyes and a face that was nearly her own. The resemblance was unmistakable, and a cold wave of horror washed over her as she realized the truth. "You are my blood," the figure whispered, its voice a rasp that seemed to come from all directions. "You carry my legacy, my darkness. I was waiting for you, Rachel, waiting for you to come back and take my place." She staggered back, her heart pounding. "No, I'm not like you. I don't belong here." The figure's gaze hardened, and a cold smile twisted its face. "You cannot escape your destiny. The shadows are in you, just as they were in me. Embrace them, or they will consume you." Rachel felt the darkness closing in around her, pressing against her skin, seeping into her mind. She was trapped, bound to this place, to this legacy of darkness that ran through her blood. She realized now that her return had been inevitable, that she had been called back to fulfill a fate she could not avoid. As the shadows wrapped around her, she took one last, shuddering breath. The manor pulsed with life, its darkness accepting her, binding her to the house forever. In the quiet town on the edge of the forest, people sometimes spoke of strange lights flickering in the windows of Blackwood Manor, of whispers that drifted from the old, abandoned house on moonless nights. Those who dared to look closer swore they saw a figure in the window, a young woman, her eyes hollow and dark, watching them from within the shadows. But no one ever dared to approach, for they all knew the truth. The manor had claimed another, and the darkness within it would never rest. And so, Rachel's tale ends, forever entwined with Blackwood Manor's dark legacy. She became part of the shadows, her story fading into whispers that would haunt the house for generations to come.